I can't hold
I'll introduce myself real quick. I'm Jay Overton. I'm a civilian employee of the Navy, and I'm a non-resident fellow of West Point's Modern War Institute. I'll speak for myself, and everybody else is everything we're going to say here just represents us and not the institutions we work for. I don't think I'll be enlightening anyone in our audience today by making the assertion that naval forces, from those of ancient Athens to the fleets and personnel of modern America, exist to control seas and project power, frequently through use of violence. CNO said in congressional testimony earlier this year, quote, "Our joint forces relies on the Navy and the Marine Corps to control the seas in conflict and project power ashore. Those missions are timeless." And we're not here to argue against that, but I'll point out that in December 2020, just a month before that navigation plan was released, naval medical personnel deployed to the Navajo Reservation in Arizona and New Mexico, very far from contested shores or sea lines of communication, to vaccinate Native Americans against COVID-19. And this summer, several U.S. Navy commands hosted STEM education camps for school children, and Navy musicians played hundreds of concerts for civilian communities and ceremonial functions. And of course, as we speak, while Navy strategy and resourcing is directed towards preparing for near peer conflict, the highest profile uses of contemporary U.S. Navy platforms, at least amongst the general public, maybe not us, are using its bases as housing for thousands of Afghan refugees, and U.S. Navy ships and aircraft providing humanitarian support for the folks in Haiti. So this is point of all this. What our panel is going to be about is what Samuel Huntington back in the 50s called the collateral and subordinate responsibilities of a Navy. Essentially, not what it's made for, but what it spends a lot of its time doing. In fact, what the U.S. Navy has really spent most of its time doing. Many of the great panels here have been about battles, ships, obviously that sort of thing, heroic personnel. But most of the day-to-day of the Navy is doing other stuff, for lack of a better term. We're going to focus on three of those things today with our three panelists here. Two from the 19th century, one dealing with Navy's enforcement of fisheries laws, one dealing with Navy exploring expedition in the 1840s, and then one in the 20th century dealing with Navy's role in what many consider the art form of the 20th century, film. We're joined today by our panel's distinguished commentator, Dr. Jason Smith. He's an associate professor of history at Southern Connecticut State University. His scholarship includes articles in journals including Journal of Military History and International Journal of Maritime History. And in 2018, he wrote the award-winning book To Master the Boundless Sea, the U.S. Navy, the Marine Environment, and the Cartography of Empire from UNC Press. All right, so we're going to start off with, we have Dr. Blake Earle, who's here in person, and then we're going to go ideally to Mike Burney, who's online, and then we'll top it off with Dr. Will Murray. Dr. Blake Earle, he's going to talk about the Navy's role in the commercial cod and mackerel fisheries during the 1840s and 50s. Blake's an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University at Galveston, where he teaches classes on the history of the Navy and American maritime history. Before coming to A&M Galveston, Blake was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Presidential History at SMU. Blake published articles in the Journal of the Early American Republic, Environmental History, and he has a forthcoming article in an International Journal of Maritime History about the Navy and the transatlantic slaves trade. The paper he's presented today is from his book project, The Liberty to Take Fish, Fisheries and Federal Power in 19th Century America. Thank you, Blake.
All righty. Thank you, Jay. Thank you to my co-panelists for allowing this to happen, and thanks for all of you for being here. All right, so as Jay mentioned, this paper that I'm presenting, Fishing for a Mission, the United States Navy and the Environment of the North Atlantic, is part of a larger project that looks at the role of commercial fishing in the North Atlantic in the development of American statecraft from the era of the American Revolution to the era of the American Civil War. All right, so the summer of 1852 witnessed the most pointed 19th century diplomatic exchange between the United States and Great Britain over the North Atlantic fisheries. British officials dispatched warships to the waters off the coast of Britain's remaining North American colonies with orders to bar American fishermen from the fishing grounds. American Secretary of State Daniel Webster, speaking from his home in Marshfield, Massachusetts, offered an unequivocal vow that the federal government would stand with the nation's fishermen. Be assured, Webster intoned to a crowd that welcomed him home, the interests will not be neglected by this administration under any circumstances. And in words that no doubt resonated with the inhabitants of a seaside town, quote, the fishermen shall be protected in all their rights of property and in all their rights of occupation, hook and line and bob and sinker. As Webster noted, the hardy sons of Neptune that exploited the fishery wealth of the North Atlantic were, quote, the very nurseries of our Navy, and thus an essential component of American statecraft. That Webster invoked the Navy in defense of American fishermen would have been of little surprise to 19th century ears. When observers sought to defend the rights of fishermen from enemies both foreign and domestic, they frequently depicted fishermen as an integral part of the nation's security. While the link between fishing and fighting may seem tenuous and was rarely, if ever, tested during the 19th century, this rhetorical move was a product of the struggle for independence and had an Atlantic-wide pedigree. Fishermen played an integral role in the war for American independence. As carriers of trade and purveyors of rations, fishermen did much in ensuring the success of the American cause on the battlefield, but the enduring memory of fishermen was their role as seamen and soldiers. Fishing vessels constituted an important part of the first United States Navy as ship owners leased their schooners to the Continental Congress to quickly and cheaply be transformed into warships. Men were likewise mobilized for the cause as fishermen from Marblehead, Salem, and Beverly filled the muster rolls of the Navy and Army alike. Future generations would remember this service and rally around the North Atlantic fisheries as a nursery for the nation's Navy. The logic of national security had wide purchase as the nursery of the nation's seaman argument became ubiquitous during the 19th century. This would not, however, be the last time that the historical trajectories of the North Atlantic fisheries and the Navy intersected. As Britain attempted to curtail American fishing rights during the summer of 1852, the Navy was central to Washington's response. But what the Navy did had less to do with the fishermen than it did with the fish. When warships arrived in North Atlantic waters, British commanders were under order to remove any American fishermen found fishing within 3 miles of the coast of Britain's North American colonies. While the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution granted Americans the liberty to take fish in British waters, the subsequent Convention of 1818 stipulated that, quote, the United States hereby renounce forever any liberty heretofore enjoyed to take, dry, or cure fish on or within 3 marine miles of the coast. London's decision to strictly enforce the terms of the 1818 treaty came at a time of flux in North Atlantic politics and in the North Atlantic itself. Since the 1840s, Britain had hoped to encourage the United States to offer a reciprocal trading agreement with its northern neighbors. By 1852, British diplomats had grown tired of American foot dragging and hoped to use the removal of American fishermen from coastal waters as a stick to encourage reciprocal trade. At the same time, those waters were becoming more and more valuable to American fishermen as the demand for mackerel and inshore dwelling fish skyrocketed during the second quarter of the 19th century. Changes in politics and changes in the environment fostered confrontation between the English-speaking nations during the summer of 1852. With British ships threatening to forcibly remove fishermen from waters they relied on, action of some kind was needed. Confrontation between warships and fishing schooners over this valuable maritime commodity presented the possibility of a local clash spiraling into an international incident. Furthermore, Washington wanted to save face on the international scene and protect the rights and interests of American citizens. Inaction was not an option, especially after Webster's rousing words at Marshfield. And what amounted to the Millard Fillmore administration's most substantive response to the announcement of British restrictions, the president sent famed naval commander Matthew C. Perry and the steam frigate USS Mississippi to the region with the ostensible goal of protecting the lives and property of American fishermen. The fact that the Fillmore administration landed on as distinguished a seaman as Perry to patrol the fisheries during the summer of 1852 may hint at the symbolic importance accorded this mission and, by extension, the fisheries. While Perry's patrol of the fisheries portended the possibility of the Navy fulfilling its traditional military role of fighting foes and showing the flag, it was mostly concerned with supporting American commercial activity. The Navy had taken on a commercial role by concluding trading agreements, securing foreign markets, and ensuring access to natural resources. But, as we'll see, Perry's mission did much to further understanding of the marine environment and the nature of this resource. In 1852, the Navy was not merely a bulwark for the fishing industry, but an important conduit for knowledge about the ocean environment. The Navy's commercial mission rested on collecting information about peoples and environments that might have contributed to the breadth and value of American enterprise. After all, the commerce of 19th century America relied not just on finding international markets to absorb American produce, but also on understanding and exploiting the natural world, something I'm confident we'll hear more about with Michael's paper if he's able to, in fact, join us, as the Wilkes expedition was the most ambitious of such endeavors on the behalf of the Navy to better understand the natural world, though it was certainly not the only example we see in naval history. So in his instructions emanating from the Navy Department, Perry was charged with, above all else, gathering information about the series of seizures of American fishing vessels that crested with the announcement of British restrictions that summer. As Secretary of the Navy, John P. Kennedy conveyed to Perry, quote, "It has become necessary that the executive of the United States should speedily inquire into and become acquainted with all that has transpired in reference to the said seizures, the cause which has led to the same and the manner in which they have been made." Thus, Perry was instructed to consult both authentic and reliable sources relating to the facts and circumstances of any seizure, with the hopes of compiling, quote, "all the facts which may be necessary to be known." But the Navy Department's instructions focused solely on the information pertaining to the situation upon the seas, the circumstances of the seizures, and not on the situation within the seas. When the Fillmore administration sent Perry to the fishing grounds, Washington had little inkling that Perry's reports would be concerned as much with the fish as with the fishermen themselves. During his cruise along the coast of Cape Breton, the Madeline Islands, and across the Bay of Chaleur, what Perry concluded to be, quote, "the most frequented resorts of the American fishermen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence," the naval commander came to the conclusion that of, quote, "the great number of American vessels, most were engaged in mackerel fishing." Noting how the American mackerel fleet, quote, "absolutely whitened the waters of these coasts," Perry was also struck by how few cod fishermen were in the region. The cod fisheries had, of course, for centuries dominated the Atlantic trade in fish as one of the most valuable commodities drawn from the seas. But changes in the ocean and changes in the fishing industry at mid-century made the small, oily mackerel an increasingly valuable catch. The second quarter of the 19th century witnessed an unprecedented uptick in the number of mackerel fishing ventures launched from American shores. Beginning in the second decade of the 19th century, Yankee fishermen devised and subsequently improved a method of catching mackerel that relied upon a new kind of fishing jig that did not require the laborious process of baiting each and every hook. With increasingly ruthless efficiency, American fishermen soon overran the mackerel stocks nearest to American shores, thus forcing skippers to sail further and further afield in search of their prey. Reaching a peak in the early 1830s, mackerel fishing was on the eve of the 1852 fisheries dispute, once again in its ascendancy, as American fishermen invaded North Atlantic waters with seemingly little regard for decades-old treaty stipulations. These changes, however, were not solely the result of increased technological efficiency, but had an environmental component as well. Two important elements in the ecology of the North Atlantic are the Atlantic cod and the Atlantic mackerel. The conditions created by the climate, geology, and chemistry of the North Atlantic made it a welcoming home for these fish. Cod are largely non-migratory, preferring to stay in the region's relatively cool waters year-round, spawning offshore where they spend much of their lifestyle. Atlantic mackerel, on the other hand, are decidedly migratory, moving as far south as the Carolinas and as far north as the Strait of Belle Isle and the Labrador Sea, even approaching the coast of Greenland in some years. These fish are most at home in open waters and do not shy away from coming inshore, especially in the spring. And the fisheries dispute of 1852 came at a period that climatologists have called the last gasps of the Little Ice Age, in which global temperatures, especially in the North Atlantic, decreased dramatically. And what we see there is a consequential decrease in bioproductivity as plankton responded to cooler temperatures with lower yields, and cod particularly bore the ill effects of this cooling. Despite being a cold water fish, cod was unequipped to contend with such a significant cooling. As temperatures dipped below the optimal threshold for spawning and growth, the population of cod in the Northwest Atlantic declined. By 1850, cod had disappeared from the western coast of Greenland, with Newfoundland experiencing a dramatic decline as well. By the middle of the 19th century, the environment of the Northwest Atlantic was no longer supporting such a large community of cod for fishermen to exploit. While cod numbers declined significantly amid this cooling, mackerel fared better, if only marginally. Mackerel were not as devastated by the cooling of the mid-19th century. Although their migratory range was severely curtailed, failing to even reach Newfoundland, these fish remained in relatively warmer waters further south. So this cooling of the mid-19th century created an ecological situation by the 1850s that saw a significant decline in the cod population, allowing for a relative rise in the mackerel population. Fishermen responded to this. This period could be characterized as one of crisis and created tension among fishermen as long-held practices, cod fishing, were forced to change to accommodate new environmental realities, mackerel fishing. Yet the political practices that governed the fisheries failed to change as American fishermen devoted more attention to ever to pursuing and catching the inshore dwelling mackerel. While American fishermen constantly altered their fishing habits across the 19th century, the relative rise in the number of mackerel had political consequences. Unlike the benthic dwelling codfish that had for so long occupied the attention of New England's fleet, the mackerel was a migratory species that moved into coastal waters during the course of the summer fishing season. This ecology was poised to create trouble in a diplomatic regime that barred American fishermen from those very waters. Perry observed this tension firsthand. The mackerel, Perry explained, usually resort in shoals to the bays and indents of the coast, leaving fishermen little choice but to pursue their catch past the imaginary line that demarcated Britain's exclusive waters. But as to be expected, in quote, the engrossing and exciting occupation of taking them in thousands with the hook, they frequently follow the fish into forbidden waters, doubtless in many instances when the weather is thick or hazy and when distances computed by the eye are deceptive. It was not then the vindictiveness of the British, the machination of Canadian provincials, or even the ignorance of Americans that created controversy in the summer of 1852. Instead, it was the fish. The natural fickleness of the fish did much in creating these tense diplomatic circumstances, something the naval officer was keen to note. The remedy to this situation was, of course, political, and the problem was not one of information. Perry's instructions stressed, quote, the necessity of full and timely explanations to the fishermen of the United States of the obligations which they owe equally to the laws of their own country and to the rights of the British Crown to avoid any infraction or violation of the stipulations of the Treaty of 1818. Yet during his cruise, Perry did give credit to the acuity of American fishermen. In addition to the paeans to the hardiness and patriotism of American fishermen so common in 19th century political rhetoric, Perry praised the fishermen as, quote, exceedingly intelligent men who, quote, understand very well the usual recognized boundary across which they pass at their own risk, and if in the pursuit of fish they trespass beyond the prescribed limits, they knowingly take the chance of seizure. Instead, a political fix required taking ecology into consideration. Perry, quote, presumed that the mackerel will continue their periodical visits to their usual haunts, and thus render the status quo of the Convention of 1818 untenable. American fishermen complained of the difficulties imposed by the arbitrary maritime boundary. Provincials in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, at least as Perry surmised from his cruise, likewise desired altering the status of American fishing rights as they were, quote, anxious to draw tight the bonds of neighborly friendship. Perry, in his perspective from the fisheries, advocated for a reappraisal of the Anglo-American Convention and urged those in Washington to make any concession necessary to secure expanded fishing rights. Any concession of interest, like free trade, Perry remarked, would be cheap for the inappreciable privilege of taking fish within the entire waters of the provinces. Perry even suggested that a treaty that aligned political needs and ecological realities would ensure the continued health of the ecosystem. While, quote, these sources of wealth seem to be exhaustless, they will be seriously injured in consequence of the wanton destruction of the fish and the disturbance of their fishing grounds, and hence the necessity of stringent laws for their preservation. Perry's cruise on the contested waters of the North Atlantic demonstrated how the environment was a crucial component of transatlantic relations. Any political arrangement failing to comport with this ecology would do little more than sow Anglo-American discord. And coming to this conclusion, though, Perry's cruise showed that the environment had become a component of the Navy's mission as well. The remainder of the 1852 fishing season passed with little drama. The kind of destabilizing confrontation between American fishermen and British warships thankfully never materialized, perhaps because of Perry's presence in the region. Within a couple years of this incident, however, the United States and Great Britain concluded a new treaty, one that did away with the 3-mile prohibition in exchange for trading reciprocity between the North American nations. In effect, Anglo-American diplomats had followed Perry's observation that any agreement that ignored ecological realities would no doubt fail. The kind of environmental information that naval officers like Perry conveyed to Washington had the potential to inform diplomatic proceedings. As the American minister to Great Britain, James Buchanan, prepared to negotiate the new treaty in 1854, Secretary of State William Marcy articulated the shortcomings of the Convention of 1818 and how its ecologically out-of-date provisions, quote, will prove a constant source of irritation and controversy may disturb peaceful relations between the U.S. and Great Britain. Marcy continued, observing that, quote, when the Convention of 1818 was entered into, the taking of cod was the all-important branch of the fisheries. But now it is superseded in point of importance by the mackerel fishery. Given the profit-seeking motive of American fishermen, quote, when they fall in with shoals of mackerel, fishermen could not be expected to resist the temptation of following them within the shore limit fixed by the Convention of 1818. Whether or not Marcy had personally read Perry's report from 1852 before he relayed these instructions to Buchanan is unclear. But what is clear is that the Navy played a vital role in conveying environmental information like that from its watery origins to the seat of power. And in so doing, Perry, like the antebellum Navy more generally, proved capable of not only shaping the conduct of war, but of peace too. Thank you.
Thanks. Fantastic. So like 180 years ago, the Navy was involved with things like climate change and illegal fisheries. Nice thing.
It hasn't come up again.
Right, exactly. This is history and it's irrelevant, but thanks for that.
Which is weird, because like the Royal Australian Navy, they still do fisheries protection as their issue, or as one of their issues. They don't have a separate Coast Guard like we do.
All right, our next panel is Dr. Mike Vernery, who's going to be joining us online there. Mike received his PhD from the University of New Hampshire in 2016. He's an assistant professor of history at Drury University in Springfield, Missouri. His paper draws on his forthcoming book entitled A Great and Rising Nation, Naval Exploration and Global Empire in the Early U.S. Republic, which will be published in March 2022 by University of Chicago Press. Take it away, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Jay. Maybe I should do a sound check since I'm not there in the room with all of you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Good. Let me try to share my screen here and get my PowerPoint up. Let's see here. Okay. apologies for taking a little while to get here. I really appreciate your patience there. I had a last-minute technological issue, which, of course, you have to anticipate, but nonetheless, I did not. Let me try one more time. Here we go. All right. Are you able to see that? I can't hear anybody. But are you able to see that slide?
You're good to go, sir.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for showing up to our panel, the last panel or series of panels for what's been a great conference. Thanks especially for my colleagues who are presenting here with me, to Jason for commenting on our papers, for Jay for keeping this squadron organized, and it's no mean feat to keep historians or squadrons organized. A special thanks also to the Naval Academy for hosting this conference and for doing all the hard lead work that would allow folks like me here in Missouri to join you. So the paper that I'm about to present, as Jay noted, draws from my first book project entitled A Great and Rising Nation, Naval Exploration and Global Empire in the early US Republic, and that's going to be out in March. This is not the official cover. This is just one of the meager ideas that I offered to the press as a possible cover here. So hopefully the final one will look much better. Nonetheless, like many scholarly books, mine tries to make a whole series of arguments, but a dominant thread is what I want to talk about with you today, and that's how US naval exploration became a force for cultural diplomacy with regards to Europe. In other words, US officials relied on sea power to lay claim to a kind of Western civilizational maturity in European capitals. To do so, however, they had to transform the European model of naval exploration and adapt it to US political ideologies. The result was a hybrid, a naval policy that sought European acceptance on both European and US terms. And first, a little bit of background, as I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with. Various European and Asiatic powers had been fitting out maritime voyages of discovery for centuries by the early 1800s. Before the Enlightenment, these activities had largely been pragmatic, quests for territorial and economic expansion, as well as religious and monarchical glory. With the advent of the scientific revolution, however, discovery was no longer perceived solely as a royal, national, or religious achievement, but as a heroic contribution to Western civilization and science. And we might use the phrase empire of science here, a transnational imperial space that could be appreciated in myriad forms, including lectures, publications, universities, museums, artifacts, technologies, and also methodologies. And this was also a competitive space where nations, through individuals, scientific individuals, and institutions, jousted with each other for prestige. The Royal Navy was one of the most active contributors to this empire of science in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's a process that, and some goes back quite a ways, but and for our purposes, was partly established by Captain James Cook, as you see him here, whose voyages entered the Royal Navy into this kind of career of scientific imperialism. The Lords of the Admiralty strengthened this tradition in the 19th century. So the second Secretary of the British Admiralty, Sir John Barrow, for example, argued that the Royal Navy ought to expand on Cook's voyages through new exploring expeditions. He believed that these missions would increase scientific knowledge, train future generations of naval officers, promote Britain's expansionist aims, and also bolster Britannic pride. Accordingly, the Admiralty Office dispatched dozens of exploring expeditions across the globe in the early 1800s. This Royal Navy context is important because there were prominent US citizens in the early Republic who admired Cook and his successors and wanted the US Navy to engage in similar feats of scientific discovery and conquest. And I have a family portrait of some of these characters here. These are folks that I call explorationists or supporters of US naval exploration. And they tended to either be middle class or mid-ranking naval officers, those who had a lot to gain by going out on these kinds of voyages, or governing elites, high-ranking diplomats, presidents, secretaries of the Navy, members of Congress, etc. And these men were honor hawks. They craved European recognition and esteem, and they were deeply concerned with honor and with character on both an individual and a national level. And you'll note on the bottom left of the screen there's a signature by one of these characters who's actually not a a naval officer or a politician or statesman. He was just simply a school teacher who really got enamored with these kinds of voyages. But note especially the flourishes that he has for his signature. These are people who think highly of themselves, who are also very concerned about national honor. There's been plenty of good recent scholarship demonstrating the anxiety felt by many white US citizens about their national standing vis-a-vis the great powers of Europe. And this is in part because the American Revolution had two goals. The first was political independence, or home rule. And the second was equality with European empires. And Jefferson states this very clearly in the Declaration of Independence, that it was time for the fledgling nation, quote, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, end quote. Separation, or immediate independence, came faster and sooner than international equality, however. Achieving parity with European powers meant that the United States had to become a kind of great power itself. Great powers in the 19th century had three basic attributes as I see them. First was what I call developmental strength, or strong economies and powerful militaries. Secondly, there had to be a degree of what was considered to be cultural sophistication, and this is by European standards, including contributions to Western art and science. And then lastly, you had to have the recognition diplomatically of being a great power by another great power. And this last qualification often came with the expectation of playing balance of power politics in Europe and the Mediterranean. US citizens were generally suspicious of large-standing militaries, even navies. And I'm thinking here especially of the work of Craig Simmons, Navalist versus Anti-Navalist, and also William Lehman's The Long Road to Annapolis. Furthermore, they had little appetite for intervening directly in European affairs or Ottoman affairs, and many were also more cost-conscious than European powers, valuing government frugality. However, while most white US citizens appear to have had a deep desire for the kind of respect that the great powers of Europe afforded to each other. In essence, and this is kind of interesting to me at least, and hopefully for you, they sought European recognition as a great power without having to act on some of the chief requirements of great powerhood. This is a student who wants the A, having not completed all the assignments in the course. For explorationists, dispatching the US Navy on a career of global discovery appeared to be the ideal vehicle for achieving cultural parity with European powers, largely because that was one of the more visible activities of the great powers on the world's oceans. And it was especially visible through the publications that they released when they would return home after their voyages, through other press accounts and newspapers. American newspapers followed these various European navigators quite closely, and then also through museums in addition. Early explorationists in the US tended to portray the empire of science as a common treasury for all mankind, something where every Western nation could deposit into this treasury and earn the thanks of all the other account holders for this treasury. Free riders, however, were frowned upon. An example of this line of thinking comes from Commodore David Porter, probably someone who is fairly well known here in this audience. Oh, did I lose my screen? Or can you still see it? Okay, I'm gonna say that you can still see it. So David Porter, in October of 1815, wrote to President James Madison and offered to lead a voyage of discovery into the Pacific Ocean. Recounting the names of famous European navigators, Porter bemoaned that, quote, every nation has successively contributed in this way but us. We have reaped all the advantages of the labors of other nations, and gratitude and duty now call loudly on us to add to their store. We, sir, are a great and rising nation, Porter reminded Madison. It was time to put the United States, quote, on an eminence with others, end quote. Nothing ever came of this proposal, but the theme of naval exploration as repaying a national debt to the empire of science would continue. In his first annual message to Congress in December 1825, President John Quincy Adams, pictured here, resurrected Porter's old proposal for a voyage of discovery to the Pacific. Quote, in assuming her station among the civilized nations of the earth, Adams contended, the United States had an obligation, quote, to the improvement of those parts of knowledge which lie beyond the reach of individual acquisition, end quote. He portrayed the discovery voyages of European navies as, quote, heroic enterprises that have not only redounded to their glory, but to the improvement of human knowledge, end quote. Anticipating criticism, Adams then changed tack. Having spoken in a romantic language of international honor, he then proposed that the Navy make a, quote, useful investigation nearer home. And in this case, what he proposed was that the Navy would chart the northwest coast of North America. Adams' proposal went further than Porter's ever did politically. But nonetheless, no official US exploring expedition set sail during his presidency. And this was largely because the terms in which Adams based his arguments were not sufficiently Americanized or Republicanized. Outfitting expensive voyages of discovery on the basis of national honor and the empire of science might make sense in London or Paris, but it made less sense to small r Republicans who preferred smaller, less expensive governments. Ironically enough, then, it was left to Adams's bitter enemies, Jacksonian Democrats, to dispatch the nation's first official maritime voyage of discovery. This time, however, explorationists had learned their lesson. With US maritime activity increasing rapidly in the Pacific world, explorationists emphasized the humanitarian and commercial benefits of naval exploration, and much the same kind of rhetoric that we heard from Blake a moment ago, of wrapping these various jack tars in kind of a nationalistic embrace. In 1838, one Jacksonian Democrat representative put it this way, quote, there were men in the country who would be delighted with an account of the butterflies that sip the nectar of the flowers that spring up on coral rocks. Science, however, should only have been incidental and subordinate to the great purpose of the squadron. So these Jacksonian Democrats were more interested in empire of commerce than they were in empire of science. So that great purpose was charting navigational hardships, rescuing stranded sailors, and intimidating Oceanian peoples into treating shipwrecked US sailors with more compassion. Cartography was still science in many ways, but it was the practical sciences of commercial expansion, not the lofty sciences of European academies. And here, I'd refer you to Jason's wonderful recent book on the US Navy, Cartography and Empire, as you see here, which was very informative for this paper and for these sections of the book. Rhetorical support for what became the United States Exploring Expedition, or XX, as contemporaries called it, was therefore vastly different from the arguments laid down by Porter and Adams in the 18-teens and 1820s. When Jacksonian Democrats joined with Whigs to dispatch the expedition in Congress, they were voting primarily for an empire of commerce and only secondarily for an empire of the higher sciences. Intriguingly enough, however, they ended up with both. Between 1838 and 1842, the XX surveyed vast stretches of the South Pacific, going all the way down to Antarctica, and the northwest coast of North America, where they charted, surveyed, collected, and negotiated, and sometimes killed Oceanian islanders. One of the primary results of the expedition was a treasure trove of charts, 249 charts in total, which were available for sale at US custom houses at the cheapest rate possible. Sea captains applauded the commander of the XX, Commodore Charles Wilkes, in private and public correspondence. We see him here. At the same time, the XX carried a bevy of scientists and their equipment. And over the course of 4 years, they collected tens of thousands of specimens. And I could list them, but that would take most of my time here as far as the categories. But nonetheless, needless to say, there is so much material that Congress created the first publicly funded museum of natural history in the United States, the National Gallery, on the second story of the US Patent Office. This is what it would have looked like around the time period, although it is a little bit later after these collections had already moved over to the Smithsonian. Congress then appointed Wilkes, the XX commander, to be its superintendent. The collections that Wilkes oversaw would eventually form the nucleus for the Smithsonian collection, where they were moved between 1857 and 1858. And I found this to be one of the more interesting findings of my research, that the US Navy, therefore, is one of the great founders of the Smithsonian, a contribution for which the Navy has never received proper credit. Congress also charged Wilkes with composing a narrative of the voyage and overseeing the production of 14 scientific volumes. And you see some of these here. The State Department sent copies of each volume as it was developed to the major European and non-European powers. This was already common European practice, a kind of great power book diplomacy, meant to physically prove a nation's contributions to the empire of science. While Congress grumbled about the expense of producing these really beautiful volumes that you can still see in various archives, they nonetheless paid for them to be as handsome and magisterial as possible. And hopefully you have a sense of that there. Gradually, the cartographic and scientific results of the XX began to lay the groundwork for the United States to lay claim to great power status. The charts of the XX made the South Seas that much more accessible to US mariners, thereby increasing the nation's economic capacity. In terms of civilizational maturity, meanwhile, the scientific achievements of the XX allowed the US to make the kinds of honorable contributions to Western knowledge necessary for cultural maturity in European capitals. While European respect was slow coming, there were some gestures in that direction after the return of the XX. So Wilkes, to go back to him, for example, was awarded a gold medal by the World Geographical Society in 1848. And even the Times of London begrudgingly recommended Wilkes' narrative and charts, quote, to the careful perusal of our own South Sea whalers, end quote. However, I argue in this book that it would take more US Navy expeditions, especially several to the Arctic in the 1850s, before the United States finally began to receive the kinds of European and British acclaim that US explorationists most desired. Nonetheless, that's a story for another time, and I want to make sure we have time for discussion. So let me thank you here and turn it over back to Jay for our final paper.
Fantastic, thanks, Mike. You don't have to go too far to learn. Of course, the Navy is still very involved in exploring. Last night at the museum, of course, they've got a whole setup about the graduates of this academy who went on to be astronauts. And there's still a lot of talk. I live up near Seattle. We're still, that's where all the Coast Guard's icebreakers are at. And they're still working on how the Navy is going to get involved in the Arctic, do its own exploring. And on a very personal front, when I read Mike's paper, I was actually sitting just at a state park close to my house, which is right over where the XX, they camped there or anchored in for a few weeks. So pretty much in the Puget Sound area, almost every thing you see that isn't named from Native American is either the Vancouver expedition, they came through and named half the things they saw, and then Wilkes came through and either renamed the stuff after American naval folks or just named, if they didn't know what it was, they named it something new itself. So almost everything around there, a lot of things named after this expedition, still around for us. Our final presentation, which examines a niche element of the U.S. Navy's cutting-edge capacities, its ability to deliver newsreels and movies to service members while underway. Panelist for this subject is Dr. Will Murray. Will's an assistant professor of media law and media history in the Manship School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University, where he studies analog to digital media technology transitions and the history of media tech more broadly. He served in the U.S. Navy Reserve for 8 years as a public affairs officer, of all things. Yeah. And he has a new book out with the University of Missouri Press called The American Newsroom, A History, 1920 to 1960. Will, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay, and thank you all for being here at the last panel of the day. I appreciate that. It's definitely an act of endurance and intellectual stamina, so thank you. Thank you in advance also, Jason, for your comments. And so could you kill the lights a bit? Or dim the house lights, I guess we should say. So.
You get them half are going, or
sure. Or I'd be all nothing there. That's okay.
Yeah. That'll be as good as it gets, I guess. But
and all right, is this like decorated? And my images will not be quite as glamorous as those awesome books from the U.S. Congress's generous donation for science books, but we'll have some interesting images, I think. So I'll set the scene with a quick story that could very well have happened. Imagine you're from Casper, Wyoming, which is a very tiny town I've been to on a road trip, and I have family who live there and from there. Imagine you're in the Navy. It's 1932. It's summer. The world's mostly at peace, but you are homesick like crazy. And some of you folks know what I'm talking about, how that feels. And you finish a long day on the USS Louisville, which got commissioned in the summer of '31, and it's one of the new light cruisers under the treaty from that time period. Anyway, you're retired, exhausted, you do all your chores, do all your turnover, and there's a movie on the upper deck. And you go watch a movie, and the movie is A Man from Wyoming with Gary Cooper, and you feel much better about yourself. This is what movies can do for sailors, but it's also other implications for what movies can do for the Navy with internal audiences and public audiences. So I'm going to present my paper in a more interactive kind of way. I'm a mass comm professor, so I don't really read my papers as much. I don't have that skill. I also probably wouldn't read as dynamically as my colleague here, so I'm going to go ahead and mostly narrate on my high points with some images. Next slide. So I'm going to argue in this project that the Navy's motion picture service, that's what it was called, was a kind of showcase technology program for the Navy. It was produced, manufactured, made during an era of GPC, kind of the first one, I guess you could call it, for the 20th century, with our adversary nations, now allied nations, Germany and Japan, who also had similar programs for ships at sea, and often were quite capable of delivering newsreels themselves to their vessels. In this program, the Navy, number one, tried to pioneer a global distribution project for its films. They would pass these things off from ship to ship. Talk about that some more this afternoon here briefly. And they also were involved in pioneering sound technology for the movies as well. We think about talkies being a Hollywood production, talking films, but the Navy also was involved in how to make these things sound good out in the open. So whenever you see an outdoor film, you can also thank the Navy for that too. So Smithsonian and outdoor films. Thank you, Navy. Next slide, please. So, in thinking about this great power competition, and I'm going to work on fulfilling the promise and making a paper to connect this project to the bigger picture, but I argue that movies at sea were really a vital part of public affairs outreach to both the Navy's sailors, but also the Navy's potential friends and enemies by showing off the greatest technology entertainment tool at the time. It's sort of like virtual reality might be for us, putting it out there at the end of the world. So you could watch films in the middle of the ocean, or on station, on atolls during World War II, you would see comedies, and this 35 millimeter film projector literally dropped off by airplane, sometimes parachuted to you, which is pretty impressive. So in all that context, I want to put the NPS. There's been great work on the Army's project, rather, for that end, and some work from before World War I. I want to pass around some guidance from viewers about this program, because you guys are all excited about this, I'm sure, but take a look at that while I talk. Next slide. And by the way, these images are from a training manual from the Navy for projectionists. You would go to projectionist school after your A school and learn this extra skill you can use in the civilian world. All right, so among my sources, and this was quite the debate in the last panel about what's legit sourcing for this kind of project. I use a lot of Navy manuals, training manuals. I just located this week, thanks to the Nimitz Libraries collection, an additional manual I'm going to use in the project, which is pretty cool. There's articles from the engineering press and from the journals from trade press. That means things like there's a journal of the proceedings of the sound pictures industry. There's a journal that is for sound pictures engineers, for example. There's a couple of specialized journals along those veins. Also, editor and publishers, and one of my favorites from my journalism research that I've done. Also, I'm drawing on my experience in the USNR, working on this a little bit. Mostly it was a prerogative of enlisted folks doing this. And I asked one sailor one time on the Macon Island, so what's your guiding philosophy of movie selection on the ship? He's like, variety. Because they'll murder us if we put the same thing twice. So you would watch like Shrek 2, and then you watch Die Hard 4, and then you watch a documentary by Dave Attenborough about penguins. It was just totally random. Always on the back of the mess hall with the sound off and the dialogue up and the subtitles, but also for special movie nights with ice cream and coffee and that kind of thing. So I'm drawing on those experiences with this project too, and it was fun to be a little bit behind the scenes with that and talk to the sailors who ran that. Next slide, please. All right, so the Navy was involved in testing of film technology. This is actually an image from a test run of a film print. They ran this thing through a 35 millimeter projector like 1,000 times, literally see how much it could take or would break. Their research really was cutting edge for the time on what to do with movies downrange. They actually set it on the 60 millimeter film camera as eventually the ideal kind of camera, but they experimented with the 35 millimeter camera quite a lot. The Navy decided to use off-the-shelf technology. And the Brooklyn Navy Yard, by the way, was the center of development for this. And even today, there's still film work being done, not by the Navy, but by civilian folks at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, including things like IMAX cameras and that kind of thing being developed there. So there's kind of connection to the Navy's work. Nowadays, the NPS is based at Millington, which is less glamorous than the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but you're still Memphis, not too far away. But the idea you use existing technology and try to tweak it, that's a very Navy thing to do. And instead of making a new egg, you just borrow an egg and make it a better egg, and hopefully it works. But I see all kinds of diagrams, illustrations from these engineering articles about what the Navy was doing to reinforce these machines. A 35 millimeter trio of footage. You would have a feature film, a couple comedy shorts, and a newsreel. This would all weigh probably 90 pounds plus all together. So the Navy was trying to find ways to also reduce the weight on the stuff, because it would take the place of things like food, fresh food, for that matter, on a vessel. So they're trying to make it smaller, more compact. So weight is a major factor in all this too. Next slide, please. All right, so the ideal mix of films, like I just mentioned, is sort of a feature film, short comedy, news reel package. The Navy had discovered, to its horror, in 1931, once they had invested about $1 million in their money, which is a lot more money today, that they discovered that 4/5 of all the films being made by Hollywood at this point in time were gangster films and therefore off limits. So there's a really droll line in my paper where I note the Navy's reaction to this development after the fact. They go, unfortunately, we cannot use most of the films produced by Hollywood at the moment, even though we spent all this money. So you see lots of musicals and comedies and lots of patriotic films. The Man from Wyoming is about Gary Cooper going to World War I basically as a soldier and discovering himself. So it's like Sergeant York before that movie was made, like the prequel. So a lot of patriotic movies. By World War II, though, which is where I want to go next this project and head into that conflict, the Navy had no rules about this. You could watch all kinds of Jane Russell movies and gangster films, whatever you wanted, and they would not have any restrictions on the moral code. But for a while, it was also a way to reinforce the moral behavior, say, to make them more industrious, more patriotic, more prone to voting and that kind of thing, and less prone to drinking. Although that part of the project also kind of failed too, I would argue. Existing films, like I mentioned, sometimes were helpful, sometimes not. I have a list of the films that were shown during World War II. I'm trying to hunt down the films that were used during the 1930s. I just found a document that might have some titles. I'm going to try to re-get some of the stuff on microfiche and microfilm. So I got to persuade my archivist at my university that I actually need the machine to look at it. They keep it kind of under lock and key. I might buy my own. I might have to save some money and buy my own, but this is where the good stuff is. Next slide, please. NMPS became a very sophisticated network. I mentioned ship-to-ship transfers. You would package these things, ship them downrange. There were about 12 distribution sites. They were in places like the Panama Canal Zone, way out there in the Philippines. You would put them from ship to ship, so it might take 2 or 3 years for you to get a movie back to Brooklyn. And they would fix it at that point. It was really busted. You probably play a film. One of the documents I read said 75 times is a good expectation to watch a movie before it broke. And they could fix it on the ship a little bit, but these things were also flammable because I don't know if you guys know about celluloid. It's basically a bomb. If it gets too dry, it can turn into a fiery inferno. If it gets too wet, it can be also dangerous. It's full of chemicals. So the Navy's trying to find ways to deal with this too. But you basically circulate these things globally and get them back. Today, you mail DVDs like you could do with Netflix. You still can. That's how you send movies out today, is through the mail and then through ships as well. The Navy features 60mm films as their favorite version of movies because these were also light enough to, again, to transfer or drop in planes, that kind of thing. I mentioned Brooklyn Navy Yard, just a picture of it. It would have been really cool to be there. If I had a time machine, opportunity to travel there, I told my students I have some weird destinations, but I think I would want to go there and check out that wasn't a film lot, but it was a special unit whose job was to pick these things and package them and put them on ships. That's where I would go and when I would go. Next slide, please. All right, they've developed these ready-to-go film kits, previewing our digital film kits today. I don't know if you know this, but in addition to DVDs, there's still a digital film. It's not a tape per se. It's like a industry standard digital film. It's not cassette either. It's a non easily obtainable format. But the Navy can send out basically a stand-up outdoor movie set for a carrier or a big deck amphib. You can watch a movie on the deck or in hangar bay. You don't have to do anything. You just get it in a box and set it up. So that technology is pioneered by the NMPS folks back in the 1930s. Here's a simplex projector with its awesome pedestal. I like how it's labeled in case you're wondering what it was. These diagrams, by the way, are just the best. I don't know half the things happening inside of them. All analog. Navy is also trying to reduce moving parts because moving parts mean major problems. So the fewer moving parts you have, the better. So there's all kinds of discussion how to have fewer things that have to move in order to show these things on ships. And get them from ship to ship and then from station to station. Next slide, please. All right, so next steps. I want to go to World War II and maybe eventually the early Cold War because these were also propaganda efforts. There was film exchanges. I have hints of this from our NATO allies that give us their movies. We would show them ours. I talked to an Army public affairs officer from Vietnam, and he talked about kinds of films that were shown for operating bases during that conflict. Clint Eastwood films were really popular after coming off patrol, which he thought was kind of ironic because they just killed a bunch of people and they're going to watch someone else kill more people. But they wanted that ice cream. So he just was giving them what they wanted. I wanted to go to the Heritage Command. I did talk to a representative of them. They've been in their archives. He said that they may be open, so I might go in December. I also have realized there's more stuff here because I found at least 3 documents at the Nimitz library. So I might come back to the academy. So if you see I usually have a bearded former Navy PAO walking around looking confused, it's probably going to be in the next meeting next year or so. So be nice to me. Here's a picture of an awesome projector camera. I have so many examples of these camera diagrams. I can spend all day long talking about them, but I won't. It's late afternoon. All right, next slide. If you have ideas, please send them to me. I'm happy to receive them. I'm also on Twitter at @WorldRewardGuy. I'll keep it nice and short this afternoon. You guys have been great. Thank you so much again for your time and attention.
Go well.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Will. I want to point out my personal experience with this. So one of my main memories of my service during Desert Storm was on a ship in the middle of the Pacific watching Rocky Horror Picture Show. Comrades were drawing a line in the sand far off. So
Oh my goodness.
still a very valuable program. I'll also point out that in Navy PAO channels, which is what I do in my day job, while Afghanistan was falling, one of the main things that was going on in various discussion was upcoming Top Gun film, when that was going to be released. Still a hot topic.
Someday soon, hopefully.
Very soon. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jason Smith for comment, and then after that, we'll take questions from the audience and hopefully some folks online. So Jason, thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Jay, and the panelists for this opportunity to comment. Naval historians have long placed the services they study within the larger political, economic, commercial, and international worlds that navies inhabit. Likewise, the work of navies in peacetime has gradually evolved to be a fruitful area of inquiry for naval historians seeking to transcend more traditional approaches. It turns out that the U.S. Navy has operated many more years in peace than in war, and it also turns out that we still have a lot to learn historically about what the Navy actually did fulfilling its peacetime roles. These 3 papers fill in hitherto little or lesser known corners of the Navy's peacetime work, though in all cases fitting within larger frameworks that are familiar to us: the protection of commerce, the acquisition of knowledge, the day-to-day experience and morale of Navy personnel, and not least defining the nation's identity and its values to the rest of the world and to the women and men in uniform themselves. So I'm going to offer some comments and some questions for the panelists. I'm not going to demand that you all answer them, especially in light of maybe the urgency with which people are going to want to ask questions and participate in discussion, but just for you guys to keep, and I'll send you a copy of my comments for later on. So, happy to talk with you more about it, or if you want to bring up, my comments, I'm happy to talk more about them with you, but don't feel obligated. So in reading these papers, I'm reminded of just how integrated the U.S. Navy was into the antebellum nation, whose culture, economy, and politics was rooted in maritime activity. As the United States transformed industrially, the Navy underwent its own technological and philosophical revolution. But those ways the Navy had been embedded in American society became more tenuous. Of course, those older linkages were replaced by new meanings and relationships to the American public. Spanish-American War, World War II in particular, saw naval heroes, battles, and ships pervade the American popular consciousness, and this continued into the post-war era through Hollywood films. Though Will's paper doesn't examine the way films about the Navy influenced American culture, nevertheless, my sense is that the Navy participated in Hollywood depictions of itself in ways that furthered the close links between the service and the American people. Absent a great power maritime war, and with the splintering of the media environment and audience today, one wonders how the U.S. Navy will continue to connect to the American public and what the consequences may be. Naval exploration and national maturity, Mike Verney sees antebellum naval exploration as the linchpin for national recognition in the eyes of Europe. He argues that naval and political leaders' appeals to an empire of science in the 1820s and 30s proved ineffective until that empire of science was fused also with an empire of commerce. One question that I've been thinking a lot about in my own work, and one that you might pursue more, Mike, is the ways naval explorers conjured the natural worlds they explored, while making observational, organizational, and procedural cues from their European, or taking observational, organizational, procedural cues from their European counterparts. Was there something unique about American encounters with nature? Or something unique about how Americans hope to use or make sense or define the marine environment that made American efforts as a singularly nationalistic and imperialistic brand? Perhaps more focus in this area will help your readers more clearly see the interconnections and differences between American and European efforts. Here, I think Aaron Sachs's book, The Humboldt Current, might be a useful point of departure. Sachs considers the role of the American Humboldtian Jeremiah N. Reynolds. I think his was the signature that we saw on your slide.
That's right.
Who was the loudest and most incessant voice calling for an American exploring expedition in the 1830s? Reynolds' rhetoric fused arguments that were both scientific and commercial, that were high science and practical science, and Reynolds' appeals to science were both practical hydrographic ones and philosophical and theoretical ones. So I would want to know more about how you see the empire of science and the empire of commerce as being distinct and part of a larger evolutionary process, because my own view is that these are really hard to tease out as singular and distinctive from one another. There seems also to be a further distinction between, as you note, a further distinction between an empire of practical science, i.e. charts and surveying, and an empire of high science, which needs to be disentangled, right? I mean, when Europeans are looking at the Americans' effort, are they privileging the high science as part of the contribution, or the practical science, or both? There are different communities here, I think, that value different kinds of sciences, which I think you maybe need to talk a little bit more about if you don't. Lastly, I note that you and others working in antebellum naval affairs, I'm thinking of Matthew Karp's book in particular, use the term seapower. You referenced it in your presentation, which in certain academic circles like this has a very fixed meaning and context. I'm wondering in your own work how you define American antebellum sea power and how we should see it relative to later Mahanian iterations of the term. Is it useful and accurate in describing the antebellum Navy? Or is it so loaded with late 19th century meaning that it obscures what we're trying to say about a fundamentally different era, although of course there are connections. So as I said, that's a lot to think about maybe, and I don't demand an answer now. In Fishing for a Mission, Blake Earle examines the 1852 Anglo-American controversy over the mackerel fishery, illuminating the close links among the Navy and fisheries, the natural environment, and international diplomacy. While political leaders failed to understand the changing environmental conditions before them, Naval Officer Matthew C. Perry, charged with protecting, studying, and reporting on the American mackerel fishery in British Canadian waters, articulated an understanding of ecological change that may have been important in settling the dispute and opening up the fishery to Americans in Canadian waters. At the very least, it reveals that American naval leadership understood the ecological and commercial realities of migratory fish and how fruitless it was to square these realities with artificially imposed political and legal constructions. Blake sees the Navy as, and you didn't actually read this part, but it was in, well, you read the first part, but not the second part. It was in your original paper. He sees the Navy as a conduit for information about the natural world to Washington. I really liked that line. And then the second part, which you left out, but I really liked, you refer to the mackerel themselves as scaly operatives, which I think is wonderful. Here is you kept that in. Yeah. Here as a reader, though, I want to know more about and from Perry. I felt like obviously the sort of larger environmental context was needed here and really important, but I felt we lost Perry for a while. You're right that Perry stands very high among the most important American naval officers of his generation. He thought innovatively about all kinds of issues. I think more work needs to be done in developing from where and how his ecological understanding emerged, if it's possible at all to get at that question. Do we see it in his other writings? Do we see it in his subsequent command of the North Pacific Exploring Expedition? As a New Englander, was Perry early steeped in the value and role of the North Atlantic fisheries? Mm-hmm. Was he unique among naval officers in his ecology? We know he's not unique because Wilkes, was invested in Maury's interested in this. But other than these guys, what can we find out sort of more broadly about the Naval Officer Corps of the antebellum era and their ecological understandings? Was this sort of thing commonplace, or was it more exceptional, just confined to this group of officers? I also wonder, Blake, how you square your argument that Perry sought both expanded fishing rights for Americans and at the same time articulated the ecological realities that expanded fishing without government intervention would exhaust the fishery itself. If the fishery were open to Americans, as Perry advocated, wouldn't that perhaps hasten the ecological destruction that he was warning about? Perhaps not, but I want to know more about how he tried to reconcile that, if at all. In the Navy, soft power in the movies, Will Mary offers a preliminary history of the Naval Motion Picture Service during the interwar period and a little bit into World War II, arguing for its place as an element of soft power, boosting the morale of Navy personnel, and offering perhaps ideological cues to them and to others about the service and about the role of the United States in the world. Here, Will offers us a technological history of sorts that moves away from the traditional focus on ship design, engineering, weapon systems, towards other technologies on ship and ashore. I think that's refreshing, and I'm grateful for that. He also highlights, actually, the unique environmental challenges of screening films aboard ship, from the spatial challenges, or opportunities perhaps, the effects of salt, air, and water, the soot from the smokestacks, the pitch and roll of the sea. These are all environmental considerations, right? One fruitful avenue for further exploration, I think, would be to get at the ways naval personnel themselves reflected on the role of movies during the service. There must be rich primary source materials in the journals and letters of naval officers and seamen about the introduction and continued role of movies. That's more than just anecdotal, but goes further. Furthermore, did movies as an evolutionary step in entertainment and morale aboard ship and ashore replace earlier forms of recreation and entertainment aboard ship and ashore? Or were they integrated into the sport, games, and other forms that characterize Navy life in the interwar period? You mentioned this a little bit, but I want to know more. On shore, did naval leadership hope that movies? I know that they espouse themes that would discourage drinking, perhaps. You mentioned that, but I also want to know: did the acts of showing the movies themselves, the very act of showing the movie, was that meant by naval leadership, or was it with a purpose to curtail behavior such as drinking or prostitution or fighting, all that stuff? I mean, I assume it is, but I'd want to see some Navy, official sort of making that case.
Correspondence would be nice.
Yeah. Let's see. And then one last element is the content of the movies themselves, which you began to get to, and I think you'll get to more as you go along in the project. Can any conclusions be drawn about the types of movies that the service acquired, other than they reflected the broader mores of American culture at the time? What can be said about their ideological bent, if anything? Did these films reify, or did they change existing hierarchies of race, gender, and class, especially as the Navy transformed in the War era? In other words, in the Cold War era, if they're showing, Hollywood's only showing a certain type of character probably for the most part, but although not really. I mean, there are prominent roles for women, African Americans, people of other races and ethnicities. Are they showing a kind of gendered and racial diversity in the post World War II era that might suggest a service that's changing itself in those ways? Altogether, these papers remind us of the environmental and natural considerations that underpin the activities of the U.S. Navy. From science and cartography to fisheries and life aboard ship, the sea remained a fundamental element with which the service had to reckon in many different dimensions, and that's something that, as you guys know, is close to my heart. Furthermore, whether in matters of national recognition in the eyes of Europe, in Daniel Webster's full-throated defense of iconic American fishermen, or in the establishment of the Naval Motion Picture Service, the Navy's work throughout history has been deeply rooted in American culture. It is my hope that naval historians will follow further these historians' lead to examine questions of nature and culture in the U.S. Navy as fruitful approaches to push the field of naval history in new and exciting directions. Thanks.
All right, we have a few questions in from our online panel. Do we have any in person?
Oh, I got.
Yes, sir.
I always have.
Okay, I'll say this to
Oh,
Yes,
no.
sir, go ahead.
Sure, yes. My question is for Will, and well, it's kind of part question, part anecdote here. So to use a personal anecdote from my time in the Surface Navy, one thing that we did was when we trained new junior officers on the code books on transmitting signals, one of the favorite messages we always used was the Admiral's barge is sending movies.
Oh, yeah.
Even 10 years ago, we're still using that same message as a classic kind of decode this message now, young ensigns, so that you can learn how to use these code books, rapidly kind of thing. And they hint at were commanders using these or were sailors using these to make messages, sort of an idea. Whenever the Perry class frigate I was on would try to get geared up for a mission, play the Hunt for Red October.
Oh, get them spun up. Oh, yeah, I've
Try
heard
and get a
stories
training
about that.
course kind of a thing. And whenever
Yeah.
the enlisted men were upset at what the chain of command was doing, they would play Mr. Roberts on the TV.
Yep.
To try and highlight that sort of thought. And I guess sort of one kind of suggestion would be, if you're looking for first-hand accounts, try the World War II Museum. They're doing
Oh, yeah. Down the road.
oral history continuously. I know a couple of historians there that literally just go from person to person recording everything.
And they're pretty open too.
And they're pretty open source for everything.
That's a really good idea. I should just go down, go see it in an hour or so. Super smart. Thank you so much for these ideas. I love the idea of training people with that classic message.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Everett. I work at NRL in my real life, but since I'm just rejecting, I'm here. My question is for Thomas Earl, really. And that is, have you evaluated in part the fact that because the U.S. has a separate Navy and Coast Guard, that certain missions such as enforcing fisheries rules and things like that, which in other countries are enforced by their navies or what to the U.S. seems like a Coast Guard, like Iceland, for instance, are done in the U.S. by the Coast Guard, and have you evaluated and looked towards them as well as they are in fact a sea service. Sorry. Are you getting what I'm?
Yeah. I think I can respond to some of that, and my sense of that is that would be an excellent question for the 20th century, not for the 19th century, because in the period that I look at, the United States is generally not too interested in enforcing these kind of treaty stipulations around this maritime resource, because more often than not, these restrictions are favored by the British in a way to curtail American access to these resources in kind of a larger project to curtail American influence and power more generally. So while you certainly are right to point out that the Coast Guard has developed this reputation as a separate sea service, more invested in enforcing these sorts of environmental regulations, I just haven't seen anything in my work in the 19th century that would suggest anybody in Washington would have had any interest in actually enforcing the laws that were on the books, because more often than not, almost exclusively, they would have seen these as regulations, constraints, limitations placed on American fishermen. That was really, that was really more about, constraining American power in some kind of way.
Thanks, George. Thank you. Excellent. We have a question online for Mike. And this is a pretty big one, Mike. So, what was the role of the federal government in the development of cartography?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, Glenn, for that question. And basically, it's huge, it's massive, and then I'll unpack from there. So, of course, there's some investment in cartography at the state level with state geographical surveys and with sort of general surveying of resources. But the federal government does a huge amount of surveying. First, especially with the U.S. survey. That I think it was Jefferson who started. They had this very cranky Swiss scientist, Ferdinand Hasler, who was in charge of it. There was a lot of critique of how quickly or how slowly it went. It frequently employed both naval officers and Army officers. It was a very good training ground for naval officers for the kind of charting and surveying and sounding work that people like Wilkes would later use in the Pacific. And I think I might even just leave it at that. I mean, then there's the U.S. Navy, and there's all these various voyages of discovery, and they come back with charts of huge sections of the world, including rivers in South America. I write about that in one chapter. Holy Land, if you need to cruise down the Jordan River into the Dead Sea, in 1848, 1849, then there's a map that the Navy charts for you to do. And then of course they would also be intersecting the hydrographic office of the Admiralty. It's quite large in terms of the federal government's investment in cartography.
And then, of course, there's the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, surveying the continental United States. It's so important and fundamentally opening up the continent for settlement and expansion in the 1840s and 50s.
Don't forget the Coast and Geodesic Survey, which became NOAA's Commission Corps. The reason why they're commissioned for.
Yeah, great. Yeah, William H. Getman has tons of works on that subject. He cut his teeth looking at sort of the Army Corps of Engineers, basically. So I recommend that book, Glenn, if that's something that interests you. I think it's called Army Exploration in the American West. It's a mid-20th century title.
All right, thank you both. And buy Mike's book too, because why not? Answer your.
Thank you.
We have another online question for Blake. Back then, back when the time area you wrote about there, how was the budget allocated and the nature of taxation? We know of imperial overstretch of the empires paying for armies and ending up in bankruptcy, while entrepreneurs made the profits of natural resources and markets. Who paid for the USN to dispute protect commercial fishing? So where'd that money come from?
Short answer is I don't know. That's not, or at least not yet. And I guess that is something we could look into here. Certainly, I've not seen or even thought to suss out what the source of this funding would have been. Though my sense is that this example, this dispute between the United States and Great Britain in the summer of 1852 was pretty unique. Certainly there was this kind of long simmering tension between the two countries over the fisheries, but this is really kind of the high point of that conflict in terms of nearing towards any sort of armed conflict. So I guess my sense of it would be that this, the Navy was used so infrequently. This may be the only time during this period that the final count for the century of how much appropriations are being put towards this would be pretty minor. But
Yes, Michael, a quick question.
Of course. Ask him a long question.
Michael, I'm going to talk to the owl, which will talk to you. It's kind of spooky, but it works. Are there parallels to China's exploration of the moon and Mars as a way to be more legitimate on the international scene, to the U.S. trying to be legitimate on the national scene with its early explorations?
Yeah, Will, thank you for the question. Absolutely. There's a wonderful book that is escaping me right now, but I can tweet it to you or send it to you. But that really kind of argues that astronomical exploration or observation is a form of signaling, which even biologists talk about as a way of communicating a certain amount of dominance or of respect worthiness in society. And that really looking at the history of American astronomy, it can be understood as a history of signaling, including the space race. So yeah, absolutely. The space race, including the East Asian space race, as we're seeing it now, is a very, very good analogy for what we're seeing, or what I write about and what I discuss. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, sir.
On the subject of historical analogies, I have a question for Blake here, and that is about the parallels between the period and the locality that you study. And I want to stipulate that one of the reasons your paper is so beautiful is that it's very attentive to the locality. But between this subject and something that seems really analogous to me, which is the seal wars that are going on in the seal fisheries off of Alaska and Canada in the 1890s. I wonder if that's something you're considering, or if people in the 1890s learned from this conflict in the 1850s in the North Atlantic. Are there connections, or is this an echo from the past that occurs more or less independently?
yeah, that's a great question when it comes to kind of setting up these sorts of analogies. And kind of my initial sense of this would be that both of these issues very much so kind of bring to light the problem, and I use that in the present tense, of governments attempting to regulate anything related to migratory species.
Right, sure, yeah.
So, animals moving around have always been a major problem for governments. So certainly we do see that kind of resonance there. But as far as kind of a direct relationship between what's happening in the 1850s with the fishing that I'm talking about and the larger seal questions that you're talking about, I don't think I've seen much in the way of any sort of direct correlation being made. And I think that largely has to do with the fact that the fish, well, the powers involved were not necessarily as interested in, saying who the fish belonged to in the same way that, the major debate over, the Canadian seals, British seals, American seals. What we see in this situation is just parts of the ocean being divided up. And so it's not like, an American mackerel could be found in British waters in the way that we see with other sorts of migratory species. I think probably a more apt comparison would be with salmon, in fact, because the anadromous nature of salmon being.
Because they migrate up specific streams?
Yes. So, yeah, there's a great book written by a historian named Lisa Waterwitz about disputes between the United States and Britain and later Canada over these salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest, because you have these fish that, essentially owe their life to their existence in either their birth and, either the United States or Canada, yet they're captured out at sea. And so there were attempts to kind of divvy up whose fish were whose. Even though they were, captured out, far beyond the territorial claim of any one nation. So yeah, I think that comparison is a little closer in my mind, but it all still speaks to this big problem of things moving around.
If you read an article and called More Salmon, More Problems. Yeah, but yeah, being from the Northwest, definitely a huge problem between tribal nations and Canada and the United States. There are like 4 or 5 nationalities you could probably give them a passport. They really want to.
Yeah, and also the influence and the presence of Native American nations that have a much stronger place in the story than they do on the northeastern coast of the United States. And the stuff that I'm studying introduces a whole other really interesting set of questions.
And with the tribal agreements that those Native American nations have, which.
Yeah, we can't, as a Navy Region Northwest person, I'll tell you, we can't build a pier. If we build a pier for a nuclear submarine, it has to have certain things so salmon can get underneath it to migrate. We have huge projects, billion-dollar projects held up because of salmon. So this is, your paper and many other things spoke very much to, this is, again, not in the past. We're still dealing with this.
Third panelist is looking to say something.
That's all right. Go ahead. Thanks, Mike. What do you got?
Yeah, thank you. So speaking of historical analogies, I have a completely unfair question for Blake. And that's that when Daniel Webster is writing about protecting the hardy sons of Neptune in the summer of 1852, I don't remember the exact date, but that must be very similar to, or very close to the period where he's writing instructions for Perry to go to Japan to protect the supposed hardy sons of Neptune, pursuing what they would have been fish at that time during a very similar era. So I was unfair because I know you didn't present on that, but I'm wondering if in your other research, if you've ever seen any parallels or if the cod fishery crisis shed some light on the Perry mission to Japan.
Yeah, that is very unfair that you'd ask me that, Michael, but yeah, no, I think certainly all of these things kind of coinciding during this period, I think kind of goes back to an important observation that Jason had in some of the comments he gave about just how maritime the United States was during this period, and be it fishermen in the Atlantic, be it sailors and whalers in the Pacific. It's very much so these men who are on the front lines of this expanding American imperium. And so the fact that we have Webster more or less at the same time directing these naval resources to kind of far different theaters for somewhat similar reasons, I think just really reinforces just the central role of the maritime world in the larger exercise of American statecraft, we could say, during the period.
We have time for one more question. I want to make sure you can get that answer.
I had two, but I guess I'll just do one. So just quickly for Mike, as Jason raised an interesting point about the idea of the distinction between high science and practical science, and it just made me think a little bit about whether there might be like a third kind of science to add to this too, which is like low or like maybe we should say popular science. And I'm thinking of like David Chapin's book on Elisha Kent Kane and this idea of like a culture of curiosity and sort of the blending between entertainment and science, and whether that sort of plays a role in this idea of spreading American influence abroad. Certainly, that book I think of as talking a lot about the Navy. The Navy, not so much an American national project, but like a service project, building the services reputation, and that sort of gets built up a little bit by the idea of this like popular science at home, that popularizes the idea of the Navy having this role, and whether that might be taking place externally, but with like the nation as the main beneficiary. If I can squeeze in my question for Blake, I was just going to ask about whether the Royal Navy plays a role in that story.
Yeah. Hey, Roger, thank you so much, and for tying us back to Jason's great comment. I wish we had more time to get into that in greater detail. But Roger, I think you're absolutely right. That's a wonderful observation to these three levels. My quick response to Jason might be that I think there is a distinction between these higher academic sciences and more practical sciences that a lot of politicians make, especially Jacksonian Democrats or Jeffersonian figures. And then I think they merge later on as people get more comfortable with the federal government taking an active role in all kinds of levels of life. I think there gets to be less concern about the federal government having a museum of natural history by the 1840s, 1850s. So I think really there's that distinction. And then I love Roger's comment as well. And then I'll give over to Blake to answer in 1 minute about the Royal Navy.
Yes. Well, no, but to expand a little, slightly more is throughout this period, from the signing of the Convention of 1818, which kind of creates the opportunity for these American fishermen to get in trouble by fishing too close into land. We have the Royal Navy and provincial cruisers kind of being this kind of near constant presence, if not physically, then at least in the minds of American fishermen, because we see various points of the 1820s and the 1830s where we'll see little spikes in the number of captures of American fishermen by the Royal Navy, which has been great for me because it created a whole great set of documents about these fishermen having to go before the Justice of the Peace, kind of being deposed and explaining what they were doing. But it certainly shows that it's really the British who have this much greater interest in enforcing the kinds of regulations that were in the region, and we see that kind of again and again throughout this few decade period here.
I too wish we had more time for this. I gotta say, this came out so much better than I even my vague original vision was when I just threw it out to the world, and I got way smarter people than me, which ain't that hard to show up to this. So I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Dr. Smith for being our commentator. That was fantastic. This was great. I want to thank Ensign Tickman for shepherding us through all this whole thing. And everybody who showed up, both online and in person. This was really great, and glad to let's keep the conversations going. So thanks so much.
This whole conference is soft power, I would argue. So, the soft power conference.